The Masai Mara Reserve in Kenya, renowned for its vast, sprawling landscapes and rich wildlife, lay basked in the golden light of dawn. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, its warmth creeping over the savanna, warming the earth after a cool night. A delicate breeze stirred the grass, carrying with it the scent of dew and the promise of another vibrant day. Among the waves of tall, golden grasses, a small figure dashed and tumbled, carefree and full of life. It was Cheetah, a young cheetah cub with a coat speckled in the distinctive spots that marked his lineage. His sleek body, still growing into the speed and agility for which his species was known, darted around playfully, chasing the leaves that fluttered down in the morning wind. Each leaf was an adventure, a fleeting target that would drift just out of reach, only for him to pounce and give chase once more. His small, energetic body rolled through the grasses as he tumbled and pounced, his innocent laughter lost in the open expanse. In the distance, a watchful figure stood poised and alert. Shani, Cheetah's mother, was one of the key cheetahs in the Masai Mara's conservation program. Her role was vital, not just as a mother to Cheetah, but as a guardian of her species, helping ensure the health and sustainability of the cheetah population in this protected area. Her slender frame was built for speed and precision. Each muscle of her body was honed by years of experience, adapting to the rhythms of the wild. Shani's amber eyes scanned the surrounding savanna, always aware of her environment, the shifting patterns of life that played out across the plains. Every morning, Shani would leave her cub to explore and play as she set off to hunt. It wasn't always easy. The hunt was a constant challenge, a delicate balance of patience and precision, but it was a necessary part of their existence. And for Cheetah, the opportunity to be alone in the wild was part of his learning, a preparation for the day he would follow in his mother's footsteps. The pride Shani felt watching him play, watching his curiosity grow, was tempered by a quiet caution. The savanna, though beautiful, was a dangerous place. As Cheetah sprinted across the open plain, he was unaware of the hidden dangers that lurked just beyond the horizon. The grass may have appeared peaceful, but it hid the dangers of the wild, predators, competitors, and sometimes the very forces of nature that could shift the balance of life at a moment's notice. Even the most innocent of games could quickly turn into a fight for survival. A sudden rustle in the tall grass caught Shani's attention. Her ears twitched, and her eyes locked onto a distant movement. A jackal, its silhouette barely visible among the blades of grass, had spotted Cheetah and was cautiously moving in his direction. The jackal, small and opportunistic, was not a threat in itself but could become one if it found an opening. It might harry the cub, trying to provoke a reaction or distract him long enough to gain a quick advantage. Shani's protective instincts kicked in, and without a sound, she started to move, her lithe body gliding silently through the grass. Meanwhile, Cheetah, unaware of the silent watch of his mother, continued to chase after the fluttering leaves, blissfully unaware of the subtle shifts in the landscape. The sight of his mother's shadowed figure in the distance was a comforting one, as was the knowledge that he was free to roam, to play, to experience the world around him in all its unfiltered beauty. The joy of his games, however, could only last for so long. The savanna had a way of pulling him back to its primal reality, reminding all who lived within its bounds that life here was not just about play. Shani's pace quickened, her muscles tightening as she neared the jackal's position. She was a skilled hunter. Yes, but her role here was also to teach Cheetah the ways of the world. The lessons of survival. Today, she would not only hunt for herself but would keep watch over her cub, ensuring that the forces of the wild would not take him before his time. She closed the distance between herself and the jackal, and with a swift, calculated leap, she sent the smaller predator fleeing, its plans thwarted by the presence of a far more capable hunter. The jackal's retreat was quick, fading into the grass from which it had emerged. Shani stood motionless for a moment, her breathing steady, her instincts sharp. She had safeguarded her cub from one potential threat. But the day was young, and the dangers of the savannah were far from gone. Cheetah, noticing the change in the air, turned and saw his mother. The excitement of the moment still hung around him like an aura. But there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes as he slowly padded toward her. He understood, in some instinctual way, that something had shifted, though he could not yet comprehend the full meaning of the events unfolding. Shani's gaze softened as she watched him approach. She was proud of him, proud of the young cub that was learning the rules of survival with every step he took. But she also knew that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. The savannah had its own rhythm, its own song, and while the early mornings might seem full of innocent play, they held a deeper, more complex truth. The balance of life here was fragile, and the playfulness of a cub could just as easily turn into the serious pursuit of survival. As the morning unfolded and the sun rose higher in the sky, Shani's focus returned to the horizon. There was still much to be done, much to be taught. For now, though, the savannah seemed to hold its breath, the winds whispering softly through the grass as Cheetah circled around his mother. The two of them one small part of the vast, untamed landscape stretching out before them. The life of a cheetah on the Masai Mara was never simple. But it was always full of meaning. Every hunt, every game, every moment spent under the endless sky was a lesson. And though the savannah could be unforgiving, it also offered the rare beauty of freedom, of survival, of connection between mother and cub, and of the enduring strength of nature. The morning had started like any other, with the savannah bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. Cheetah, the young cheetah cub, had been racing across the plains, his body still growing into the sleekness and agility that would one day make him the fastest animal on Earth. This day, however, was different. Cheetah was chasing a blue butterfly, its wings fluttering gently in the breeze, a beacon of beauty in the vast, wild landscape. He was so captivated by the delicate creature that he didn't notice how far he had strayed from the safety of the small area his mother, Shani, had allowed him to explore. The butterfly danced through the air, twisting and turning, just out of reach, leading Cheetah farther and farther from his mother. With each leap and bound, he moved farther into the open grasslands, unaware that the gentle breeze he had once played in was now carrying him into a more perilous place. When the butterfly finally fluttered out of reach and settled on a distant flower, Cheetah paused to catch his breath. It was only then, in the silence that followed, that he realized something was terribly wrong. His surroundings, though familiar in their vastness, seemed different now. The usual rhythm of the savannah, the wind in the grass, the distant calls of other animals, all of it felt distant. And most alarmingly, his mother was nowhere to be seen. Cheetah's eyes scanned the horizon, his heart beginning to race. There was no sign of Shani. No comforting shape of her sleek form standing vigilant, watching over him. He swallowed hard, a small whimper escaping his throat. "Shani," he called out, his voice small and trembling. But there was no answer. Only the soft rustling of the grass in the wind. Fear began to tighten in Kito's chest. His innocent world suddenly turning into an overwhelming sea of unfamiliarity. He took a few steps forward, hoping to see his mother. But the savannah stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no signs of life. No traces of the familiar shape of his mother. His paws moved restlessly, each step causing him to feel more and more lost. The wide expanse of the savannah, once a playground, now felt like a maze. The ground beneath him, the vast, rolling hills, all looked the same. He didn't know where to go. And for the first time in his life, he realized how small and fragile he was in such a vast and untamed world. He called out again, louder this time, but the only response was the wind, whistling through the tall grasses, carrying only the sounds of nature. Indifferent to his panic, Kito turned in a circle, his mind racing. His instincts, usually sharp and reliable, seemed clouded by the rising fear within him. He began to move in a random direction, his paws soft against the earth. But the more he walked, the further he felt from safety, and the closer he seemed to be drawn into the emptiness of the wilderness. With every step, his anxiety grew. The cheetah cub had no concept of how easy it was to become lost in the vast expanse of the savannah. He had spent his short life learning to trust his mother's guidance, her ability to keep him safe. But now, that safety had evaporated, and Kito was left to navigate the wild world on his own. His tiny paws carrying him further from the only security he had ever known. A slight tremor of panic worked its way through Kito's chest, and his heart began to pound faster. He was alone. The world that had once felt full of possibilities and joy now felt cold, uncertain, and vast. He had never truly understood the dangers that existed beyond the horizon, only knowing that his mother was always there to protect him. Kito slowed, listening for any sign of movement, any familiar sound that might indicate his mother's presence. There was nothing, just the wind, the rustling of the grass, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. It was all so still, too still. The realization that he was alone sank in deeply, and for the first time, Kito felt truly vulnerable. His small body quivered, and a low, desperate whine slipped from his throat. His wide, amber eyes scanned the surrounding grasslands, but there was no sign of her. He wanted to call out again, but his voice felt small and weak. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Kito knew he needed to find his mother. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. He had to find her, to feel the warmth of her presence once again. But where? His mind raced as he darted in a new direction, moving faster now, desperation fueling his every step. He couldn't stop moving. He couldn't stand still. The longer he stayed in one place, the more the fear gnawed at him. He had to find Shani. But with each stride, the savannah felt more unfamiliar. The wind carried strange scents that only deepened his confusion. Was that the scent of a predator? A lion? Or was it simply the wind, twisting through the grasses? He couldn't tell. His sharp senses, once so sure of themselves, seemed clouded by panic and fear. He couldn't think clearly. Hours seemed to stretch on as Kito wandered through the endless grass. The sky above had changed. What had once been a warm, golden morning was now a harsh, cloud-filled midday. The heat of the sun beat down on Cheetah's small frame, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He hadn't stopped running, not for a moment, as though the very act of movement would bring him closer to his mother. His paws began to ache, and his throat felt dry. He had never felt exhaustion like this before. But still, he pushed on, driven by the instinct to find his mother. He couldn't fail, not now. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Cheetah's energy was nearly spent. His legs felt like they might give way beneath him. Just as despair began to creep in, a familiar scent suddenly reached his nostrils. It was faint at first, but then unmistakable, the warm, comforting scent of Shani. Cheetah's heart leaped. He lifted his head, ears straining to catch any further sound. There it was again, a rustle in the grass, the soft padding of feet, and then, emerging from the tall grasses, came Shani. Her sleek body appeared, her powerful form gliding toward him with a purposeful stride. She paused, her eyes locking with Cheetah's. Cheetah's heart swelled with relief, and without thinking, he dashed toward her, his legs carrying him faster than he ever thought possible. The world fell away as he neared her, and in an instant, Shani was there, her soft, reassuring presence enveloping him. Cheetah nuzzled against his mother, feeling the warmth of her body and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. He had found her. He was safe. Shani looked down at her cub, her protective instincts immediately taking over. Her amber eyes softened as she licked the top of Cheetah's head. Her presence a silent promise that he would never be alone in this vast, wild world again. In the safety of his mother's embrace, Cheetah finally allowed himself to breathe. The fear and the uncertainty faded, replaced by the comfort of knowing that he was not alone. Cheetah was exhausted. His small, slender body had been wandering the vast savanna for what seemed like hours, searching desperately for his mother. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his paws aching with the strain. The vast openness of the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly around him, and the warmth of the sun bore down unrelenting. He had lost track of time, each moment blurring into the next as the heat and fear overwhelmed him. His mind raced, his every instinct telling him to keep moving, to find shelter or something familiar. But his body was telling him to stop. The fear of being alone, of being lost in this unforgiving land, made his heart pound with a constant rhythm of panic. He couldn't give in, though. He had to find Shani. As Cheetah paused for a moment, catching his breath and trying to orient himself, a rustling noise reached his ears. His ears pricked up. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. Cheetah's small body stiffened, his amber eyes scanning the grasses around him. The wind had shifted, and he smelled something not right. The scent of predators. Before he could react, 3 dark shapes emerged from the tall grasses on the edge of his vision. Cheetah froze. The figures were moving steadily toward him, their eyes gleaming with intent. They were hyenas, and they were closing in. Hyenas were skilled hunters, known for their strategic, relentless methods. They were not like lions or leopards that pounced from the shadows. Instead, hyenas worked in teams, surrounding their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Cheetah, small and alone, was a perfect target. The hyenas sensed his vulnerability immediately. The first hyena, larger than the others, began to circle him, its dark eyes never leaving Cheetah's small frame. The others flanked him from either side, making sure that there was nowhere for the cub to run. Cheetah's heart thudded in his chest, and his breath quickened. He was terrified, but something inside him urged him to stand his ground. His mother had always taught him to be brave, to defend himself when necessary. But this was different. These hyenas were dangerous. He had no experience in dealing with threats like this. His tiny body, still soft and untrained, was no match for the strength and coordination of these skilled predators. Cheetah's first instinct was to growl, to show that he was not an easy target. He fluffed up his fur and unsheathed his small claws, trying to make himself appear larger, more intimidating. His growl was weak, just a small sound that barely carried over the rustling of the grasses. The hyenas didn't flinch. Instead, they closed in tighter, sensing his fear and responding with their own low growls, a sound that sent chills through Cheetah's body. He backed up slowly, his small paws leaving prints in the soft earth. The largest hyena bared its teeth, grinning as it edged closer, its movements slow and calculated. The other two followed, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Cheetah's eyes darted around the savannah, looking for any sign of his mother, any sign of help, but there was nothing. The world around him was silent, save for the sound of the hyena's claws scraping against the earth as they stalked him. Panic rose in Cheetah's chest, suffocating him. His mind screamed for him to run, but he knew it was too late for that. He was surrounded. The hyenas were closing in, and he was too small and too weak to fend them off. In that moment, Cheetah's heart sank, his growls faltered, and his claws began to retract, his courage slipping away like the last vestiges of sunlight fading over the horizon. The hyenas seemed to sense his fear, and they began to taunt him. One of them lunged forward, snapping its jaws just inches from Cheetah's face. He yelped and darted backward, his body trembling. The hyena laughed, a hideous, high-pitched sound that echoed across the plain. The others joined in, circling tighter. Cheetah could feel their hot breath on his fur as they continued their slow, deliberate approach. Desperation gnawed at him. He couldn't fight him off. He couldn't outrun them. The vastness of the savannah seemed to close in around him. A place that had once felt full of life and freedom now felt like a trap. But just as he thought all hope was lost, something unexpected happened. A loud noise suddenly pierced the silence. A deep rumble that seemed to shake the very air around him. Cheetah's head snapped up, his eyes wide in confusion. The sound was unfamiliar but unmistakable, the engine of a vehicle. The hyenas froze, their attention shifting from Cheetah to the approaching noise. For a brief moment, they hesitated, unsure of what was coming. Cheetah's ears perked up, his body tense with curiosity. The growl of the engine grew louder, closer, and then, from the distant edge of the savannah, a jeep emerged from behind a cluster of trees. It was a safari jeep, the kind used by rangers and conservationists. The hyenas, startled by the noise, backed up, their eyes flickering nervously between the approaching vehicle and the helpless cub. They weren't stupid. Hyenas knew when they were outmatched, and the presence of the jeep made him uneasy. The vehicle slowed as it neared the scene, and the driver, a ranger, immediately saw the situation unfolding. The ranger was quick to react, pulling a loud horn from the front of the jeep. The sound cut through the air like a sharp crack of thunder. a noise so sudden and forceful that it sent the hyenas scattering. Their instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, they turned and fled, disappearing into the grass with a final, haunting laugh. Cheetah stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The threat was gone, the danger averted, but the shock of what had just happened still hung in the air. He had narrowly escaped death. The jeep came to a stop a few feet from Cheetah, the engine winding down. A man in the driver's seat, wearing the uniform of a park ranger, stepped out. He was tall and strong, his face lined with experience, his eyes scanning the area carefully. "Are you all right, little one?" he asked gently, his voice calm but filled with concern. Cheetah, still trembling from the encounter, could only nod, his body slowly relaxing now that the immediate danger had passed. The ranger smiled softly, his eyes warm. "You're lucky we arrived when we did," he said. "It's not safe to be alone out here." Cheetah, still shaken, let out a soft mewl, and the ranger crouched down beside him, offering a reassuring presence. He gently ran his hand along the cub's back, making sure there were no signs of injury. Cheetah didn't understand all the words, but the warmth and kindness of the ranger's touch made him feel safer, even if only for a moment. As the jeep slowly turned around, Cheetah climbed aboard the back, the ranger guiding him into the safety of the vehicle. As they drove away from the threat of the hyenas, Cheetah's eyes scanned the horizon, searching once again for his mother. But as the vehicle sped across the plains, Cheetah's heart was filled with a renewed sense of hope. He wasn't alone. Help had arrived, and maybe, just maybe, he was not as lost as he thought. Jamal had spent more than 12 years working as a wildlife conservationist in the Masai Mara, a place that had become both his home and his passion. His deep connection to the land and its creatures was undeniable. He had dedicated his life to preserving the wildlife in this vast, untamed landscape, understanding the delicate balance that existed between humans and the animals they sought to protect. On this particular day, Jamal had set out to conduct a routine survey of the area, checking the health of the wildlife and ensuring that the conservation efforts were on track. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the savanna. The air was dry and warm, and the sounds of the wild carried faintly in the distance. As Jamal's jeep rolled slowly across the plains, he glanced around, his eyes trained on the landscape. He had learned to read the signs, the subtle shifts in the grass, the movements of the animals, the patterns of the wind, that told him the story of the land. It was a skill he had honed over years of experience, and it had served him well. However, today, something felt different. As he scanned the horizon, his eyes caught sight of a small figure, a speckled cub that seemed far too vulnerable for the harsh environment around it. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the small cheetah cub immediately. It was Cheetah. The cub was alone, surrounded by 3 hyenas, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The hyenas had circled Cheetah, their movements deliberate and menacing. Jamal's trained instincts kicked in, and without hesitation, he slammed on the brakes, his jeep coming to a halt with a screech of tires on the dirt. For a moment, Jamal sat still, his mind racing. He knew that hyenas were cunning predators, intelligent and quick to exploit any weakness. But he also knew that they were wary of humans. This was the moment that could determine the life or death of the young cub. He had to act quickly. Jamal grabbed the long stick that lay across the passenger seat of his Jeep. A tool he often used for various tasks in the field. His hand also went to the whistle at his side. A sound that could carry across the savannah and alert any nearby rangers. Without a second thought, he opened the door and stepped out. His boots hitting the dry earth with a solid thud. The hyenas were still circling Cheetah. Getting closer, their bodies tensed and ready to pounce. The young cub, though scared, stood his ground, but Jamal could see the fear in his eyes. The situation was critical. He couldn't let this play out any longer. With one swift motion, Jamal raised the stick high above his head and let out a loud, piercing whistle. The sound carried across the savannah, cutting through the quiet of the morning. The hyenas paused for a moment, their attention momentarily diverted by the strange, unfamiliar sound. Jamal didn't stop. He swung the stick in a wide arc, making even more noise, hoping to disorient the predators and create enough of a distraction to get Cheetah to safety. His presence seemed to have the desired effect. The hyenas hesitated, momentarily confused by the human figure standing in their path. They were cautious by nature, and the sound of a human approaching was enough to make them think twice. Hyenas were not foolish enough to engage with humans unless they had no other choice. And Jamal knew this was his opportunity. He raised the stick again, making another sharp movement, and shouted. His voice was firm and commanding, echoing across the plains. The hyenas flinched, their instinct to retreat kicking in. One of the hyenas, the largest, took a step back, then another. The others followed, their once confident postures wavering. They seemed to sense that this was no ordinary encounter, that the presence of a human in their territory was something to be feared. For a few moments, the standoff continued. The hyenas remained in place, their eyes flickering back and forth between Jamal and Cheetah. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire savannah was holding its breath. Jamal kept his gaze steady, his body still but ready to act at any moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the hyenas began to retreat, their large, heavy bodies slowly backing away into the tall grass. Jamal didn't take his eyes off them until he was sure they had turned and disappeared into the distance. Only then did he lower the stick and relax his posture, allowing himself a moment to breathe. The danger was over, but Jamal knew the threat could return at any moment. His focus immediately shifted to the young cub. Cheetah was still standing in the same spot, his body trembling with fear, his amber eyes wide as he looked up at Jamal. The cub had clearly been terrified, but now that the immediate threat had passed, he seemed unsure of what to do next. Jamal approached slowly, his movements calm and non-threatening. He knew that Cheetah, like many young animals, might be skittish around humans, but the cub was in no condition to fend for himself. Cheetah took a hesitant step back as Jamal neared, his small body stiff with fear. But Jamal didn't rush. He crouched down, lowering himself to the cub's level, and extended his hand slowly, palm open. His voice was gentle, soothing as he spoke softly, trying to reassure the frightened creature. "You're safe now," Jamal murmured, his words a quiet promise. "You're okay." Cheetah's eyes flickered toward Jamal's hand, and for a moment, he seemed uncertain. The cub glanced around at the now empty savannah, still on edge but beginning to realize that the immediate danger had passed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he inched closer to Jamal. the instinct to seek safety outweighing his fear of the unfamiliar human. As Jamal reached out, Cheetah hesitated only briefly before his small body pressed against the man's leg, seeking comfort in the presence of the one who had saved him. Jamal felt a surge of relief wash over him. The young cheetah was safe. At least for now. He could feel Cheetah's tiny body trembling against his own. But the cub had found a moment of solace. Jamal stayed still, giving Cheetah time to adjust. He knew that the bond between humans and wild animals was fragile. But moments like these, when trust was built through calm, compassionate actions, were priceless. Jamal had seen many creatures in the wild, but few had touched his heart like this young cheetah, so innocent and vulnerable in the face of danger. After a few moments, Jamal gently helped Cheetah into the back of his jeep, making sure the cub was comfortable. The savannah, once again peaceful, stretched out around them, but Jamal knew that the journey was far from over. He would take Cheetah back to the safety of the Wildlife Conservation Center, where he could reunite with his mother and find the protection he needed. As the jeep began to move, Cheetah nestled closer to Jamal, his eyes slowly closing as exhaustion took over. Jamal smiled softly to himself. Today had been a close call, but he had made a difference. For now, Cheetah was safe, and that was what mattered most. Jamal's heart was heavy as he watched Cheetah, the small cheetah cub, nestle closer to him, seeking comfort in the safety of the jeep. The young cub, still trembling from the harrowing encounter with the hyenas, seemed to find solace in the presence of the man who had saved him. But Jamal knew that the real reunion, the one that would bring the cub peace, had yet to happen. He could only imagine how frantic Shani, Cheetah's mother, must be. She had been looking for her cub, perhaps in a panic, not knowing where to find him, nor whether he was alive or in danger. The bond between a mother and her cub was strong, especially in the wild, and Jamal knew that Shani would be desperate to reunite with Cheetah. With a deep breath, Jamal made his decision. He would not let this day end without reuniting the two. He started the jeep and drove slowly, taking great care to avoid disturbing the delicate balance of the savannah. His eyes scanned the ground carefully, looking for any signs, any tracks that might indicate Shani's movements. It didn't take long before Jamal spotted the first set of tracks. The distinctive paw prints of a cheetah, large and unmistakable, marked the ground in a gentle, flowing pattern. He had been working with the Masai Mara Wildlife Conservation Team long enough to recognize these subtle traces of movement. Shani's footprints were still fresh. With a quiet nod to himself, Jamal followed the tracks, his hands steady on the wheel. He had done this before, tracked animals, followed signs of movement across the vast land, but this felt different. He wasn't just following an animal for research or protection, he was helping to restore a family. The jeep moved through the tall grasses, the landscape unfolding before him like an endless sea of gold and green. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the savannah, its warmth still present but tempered by the cool breeze. As Jamal drove, his mind raced through thoughts of Shani, wondering how far she had traveled, how desperate she must be to find Cheetah. He couldn't imagine the anguish a mother must feel when separated from her young, especially in such a dangerous environment. After 15 minutes of navigating the savannah, Jamal spotted a figure in the distance. It was Shani. She was pacing in tight circles, her movements agitated, her body language tense with worry. The powerful cheetah mother was clearly searching, her sleek form moving with purpose but also with anxiety. Her golden eyes darted around, constantly scanning her surroundings for any sign of Cheetah. Jamal slowed the jeep to a stop, careful not to startle her. He had to approach this carefully. Shani was an intelligent predator, and while she was likely distressed, she was also cautious. Her first instinct, like any wild animal, might be to defend herself or her cub. But Jamal had dealt with many situations like this before, and he knew how to navigate the delicate dynamics between humans and wild animals. He remained calm, watching Shani closely, knowing that the next few moments would be crucial. Cheetah, now aware of the change in his surroundings, let out a series of familiar, high-pitched calls, his voice breaking the silence of the savannah. It was the sound of a cub reunited with its mother, a sound full of joy and desperation. Shani's ears twitched as soon as she heard the unmistakable sound of her cub's call. Without hesitation, she turned in the direction of the jeep, her body moving with surprising speed. Her eyes locked on the source of the sound, Cheetah. Jamal's heart swelled as he watched Shani approach. She moved with urgency, her long legs eating up the distance between her and the jeep. Her tail flicked behind her, her body taut with anticipation. Cheetah's calls grew louder as he realized that his mother was near. When the jeep finally stopped, and Jamal gently placed Cheetah down, the cub didn't waste a second. He shot off the ground and ran toward Shani as fast as his small legs could carry him. The moment the two were within reach, Cheetah hurled himself into his mother's embrace, rubbing his face into the soft, warm fur of her chest. Shani, her heart racing, crouched down to meet her cub, her instincts kicking in. For a moment, neither mother nor cub moved. They simply held each other, a moment of pure connection after a harrowing separation. Shani nuzzled Cheetah gently, her tongue moving over his small body in light, affectionate licks. Cheetah, now safe in his mother's presence, relaxed, his body still trembling but now from the comfort of being back where he belonged. Shani's protective instincts took over as she checked her cub over carefully, running her tongue over his coat to ensure he was unharmed. Her eyes, though full of concern, softened as she realized Cheetah was safe. Her ears flicked back, her body language now shifting from the tense, worried predator to the calm, nurturing mother. Jamal could see the change in her posture, the shift from defensive to trusting. She knew that Cheetah was in good hands, that he was no longer alone. As Shani stood tall, her head swiveling to look at Jamal, she regarded him with a different expression now. Gone was the suspicion that any wild animal might have toward humans. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, an unspoken gratitude that passed between them. Shani was no longer on edge. The trust was there, in her amber eyes, as she looked at the man who had kept her cub safe. Jamal remained still, allowing Shani to approach him. He knew that his job was far from over, that the relationship between humans and the wild was fragile. But in this moment, he could sense the profound connection that had formed. Shani had recognized that Jamal was there to help, not harm. Her gaze, no longer fearful, was filled with a calm, almost peaceful acceptance. It was the kind of trust that could only be earned through actions, not words. For a few more moments, mother and cub remained close, Cheetah nudging against Shani's side, his energy returning now that he was safe. Jamal took a step back, giving him their space. He knew that the bond between a mother and her cub was sacred. And the reunion was a powerful reminder of the beauty and fragility of life in the wild. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the savannah, Jamal felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done more than just protect a cub today. He had helped restore the natural order, reuniting a family that had been torn apart by the harshness of the wild. He had given Cheetah a second chance at life, and in doing so, had reaffirmed his commitment to the work that meant everything to him. As he prepared to leave, Jamal glanced back one last time at the Cheetah family. Shani and Cheetah, now together, turned to disappear into the vast savannah. Jamal smiled softly, his heart full of pride and satisfaction. In the gentle morning light, he knew that he had made a difference. Today, he had helped protect the wild creatures that called Masai Mara home. And that was a feeling he would carry with him forever.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.